There we go. Okay, time to start. All right. What's up? Fuck. Here we go. What? What's up?
That's staying.
I forgot. What's up, gang? Thanks for joining the Undiplomatic Podcast, the show with undiplomatic takes about the foreign policy scene. I'm Van Jackson, here with my co-hosts, Julia Gledhill and Matt Duss. What's up, friends?
So,
Hey.
So it's I feel like some things have happened since we last recorded.
Yeah.
Like the
so
world
much. It's
changed
been a lifetime.
4 or 5
man.
times.
These past 72 hours have been quite a year.
Yeah. Yeah. Fucking wild. Okay, so maybe we should just start with Matt. You had a very timely piece in Foreign Policy about Kamala Harris's foreign policy opportunity. Can you kind of like walk us through that? And that, I mean, that's our main beat anyway. So like we can start there.
Yeah, the basic argument was, on domestic issues, Joe Biden has been a really successful president. I ran down a list of a number of things, from the COVID relief, from the American Rescue Plan, from investing in infrastructure, from a general break from kind of neoliberal economics, and a few other things. Brazil, Ukraine are a few things that I mentioned, but then of course the Middle East is a really glaring, I won't call it an exception, but it's an example of a kind of schizophrenia that exists, and great power competition is a huge part of this too, where on the one hand there's a very welcome break from an old kind of theology of economics and understanding the need to create more jobs and the need for government to invest in our society, both in terms of people and infrastructure, but at the same time this effort to kind of sustain American military global hegemony that is ultimately, you can't have both of those things. I'm
reluctant to say too much preemptively bad about a Kamala Harris foreign policy because I don't want it to become like a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I think the sort of nudge toward opportunity is like exactly the right kind of like push that we want to have, like appeal to your better angels kind of thing. Like there's a strategic, like it's in our interest to kind of pivot in a way on foreign policy. But I don't know, man. I'm like, I feel like I'm almost overly optimistic, or like there's not enough evidence to support the idea that like she's going to embrace the kind of post-primacy framework. There's a lot of inertia there. The Biden-Harris overlap on foreign policy is probably going to be significant. So I don't know. I think for now that idea of like there's an opportunity here is
well. I mean, I think there's two things. One is that what you said is fair, but I do think it's important to note that the candidate herself, I mean, she doesn't have a strong record, by which I mean there's not a lot of foreign policy stuff out there. I mean, there's a little here and there. Yeah. What has she voted for? What letters have she signed? What things did she say when she ran in 2019? But there's also the fact that, and again, that gets to the opportunity because there is not an enormous foreign policy Harris world in the way there's kind of this, impenetrable Biden world of foreign policy, but also the principal herself does not have like views on foreign policy that were set in stone 40 years ago, which has also been part of the real challenge with Biden, even granting the things that I think he has gotten right, and they are there and they are significant. So again, I think you really picked up on the key word here, which is opportunity, but I do think it's an opportunity for her as well to engage with a kind of broader array of foreign policy thinkers in the party who've been doing this work and thinking about things in a different way. And I think it would help her to kind of help build that bench.
Yeah. So Matt, you mentioned in your piece the uncommitted movement in Michigan as a key part in moving Biden on Gaza. So we've seen, many of Kamala's potential challengers now endorse her, and she is in fact the presumptive nominee. In terms of shaping or attempting to shape her foreign policy, starting with Gaza, what do you think of the uncommitted movement now? Do you think that the uncommitted delegates have some leverage here? Do we have more opportunity with like Phil Gordon with her national security advisor? I'm curious.
Well, yeah, I do think. I mean, the uncommitted movement. I mean, they have some delegates, so they do have some influence. Clearly, there's going to be a presence both inside and outside the convention. So the answer is yes, and they've laid out their demands as well. Their demands are the same ones that they made on Biden. And what I appreciate about that movement, it is like we're not here to kind of undermine Democrats. We're here to make them better candidates. We're here to like make a very legitimate demand based on these very dire and urgent issues. Now, in terms of the personnel, yeah, you mentioned Phil Gordon, someone I know. I like him a lot. I mean, he's someone who's served in the Obama administration, and then he was at Brookings. He's, I would say he's kind of more the kind of center left, maybe even inching left part of the establishment, however one wants to take that. Yeah. I will say he did write a book about how bad an idea regime change is. So that is a, in terms of like foreign policy professionals who have actually, taken on these kinds of self-criticisms, I think that is really important. That is quite rare. People in Washington who really kind of look at questions like, well, what did we get wrong and what shouldn't we try to do again?
Yeah, there was a big divide that within the blob or the establishment, there was a big divide between those who basically co-signed the Iraq War and largely were unapologetic for it until it became just unbelievably unpopular, right? Yeah. Versus there were the minority voices within, minority as in like a small chunk voices within the blob that were trying to, were critics of that position, trying to carve another way. But the politics of invasion were just like so hegemonic that like there was no room for maneuver. And like my read on Phil was that he was in more of that latter camp. And it's like, that's not a radical, but given what DC is, that's something. It's a beachhead or a lodgement or, I don't know.
It is. And I think that distinction you make, I mean, there was a great piece, it's written probably back in like 2006 or 7, in the American Prospect called The Incompetence Dodge, where a lot of these folks who supported the war, and this includes Biden himself, kind of sought refuge. It's like, well, it was a decent idea. It was just carried out incompetently. Like, no, it's not. It was not a problem of execution. It was a problem of conception. Wow. And I think that's a real dividing line.
Yeah, well, it requires humility, which is hard to come by when it comes to
hard to come by all over this town, sad to say.
Yeah. The counterpoint too of like, okay, so Kamala is the guy or the lady, the person.
She's a lady.
Guy is gender neutral in the way I use it,
That's fair. I think dude is gender neutral. I don't know about guy, but I'll we'll allow it.
Yeah. So Kamala is the dude. I mean, kind of no matter what. So we go into November, even if she were to articulate a horrific foreign policy platform, we hold our nose and punch that ticket because, as I said in the newsletter, elections are a defensive tactic, and that the reason it's a defensive move, even if her foreign policy advocacy became shit in the next month or two, is because of the alternative, which is always the context. You have to take context into account, in the context of all that came before. So, and part of that context is fucking JD Vance and Trump, and like that's part of the other shoe that dropped while we were on hiatus or whatever. Like Vance wants to arms race and globally decouple from China. He ran on a red baiting platform and he's fucking bestie. People don't know this, or some people don't know this. He's besties with Bridge Colby and he wants to bomb Iran. He has a no strings attached policy of support for Israel's slaughter of Palestine, right? He's aching to bomb Mexico. So like,
well, okay. So I'm not disagreeing with that. I think this all is very dangerous. It's kind of brinksmanship, this reckless rhetoric, clearly could easily lead to escalation. As you wrote about North Korea, it was sort of luck that we didn't all get screwed by exactly that, just Trump's rhetoric and the war of words with Kim Jong-un, which could have gone bad very easily. Same thing with Iran after the Soleimani assassination. But for both sides kind of pulling back, that could have very well turned into a major war. So these things can go bad very easily. But that's what I'm saying too. I mean, part of their critique, and I found Vance's speech at the convention just really interesting. You know, it's fine to dismiss him as weird. He is extremely weird. I mean, this, you know, this video that's been going around about how, like, about, you know, people without kids don't really have a stake in the country. I mean, it's just weird shit.
Yeah.
Man. It's like,
it's what he's been saying. I mean, this
right.
is
No.
classic MAGA
Right.
shit, but yeah.
But I also just want to acknowledge, I do think we have to, I think we should take seriously the pitch he is making, you know, to working people, but the broader populist pitch and how foreign policy fits into it, which is this argument of like the elites have screwed us. I did my duty as a Marine, went to Iraq, I was lied to. That is all valid. Now it's attached to a really weird set of grievances and ideas about how America should work. But as with Trump, there is a very legitimate and powerful foreign policy critique wrapped into this.
Yeah, that's what makes it so scary, is that like there are kernels of truth, which makes it very easy to collect power and rally people around. Yeah, that really concerns me. But I mean, I think to our earlier point, like personnel is policy, and I'm most interested in the administration that is going to hire people with whom I can engage substantively,
Sure.
In terms of scary precedent setting. And we'll talk about that later. But
yeah, that was the other thing with Kamala, is like, I was saying that I used the term staff politique, which is like personnel is always policy, but when the principal is not doesn't fancy themselves a foreign policy person to begin with, or if it's not their priority, you know, then staff becomes like everything. Like the logic of the foreign policy is based on the composition of who's running that shit. So
yeah,
that's what,
like she's very reliant on her staff for foreign policy insights, and I think that was probably one of the bigger criticisms of her when she ran for president the first time.
Yeah. My memory was that her 2019 foreign policy stuff, I mean, which was thin, but it was like 10% better than Biden. And to me, that's, if that's what ends up happening, that's not good. But 10% better than Biden might be the difference between a ceasefire and not, you know, or aid to Israel and not, and that would be something. So,
no, I mean, for me, it's the question, okay, what are the principles undergirding this? You don't have to be an expert in every region of the world. I mean, everyone has limited bandwidth. They have probably some areas they know more about, others they know less about. But what are the principles that are guiding your approach to the world? And can you bring in people who are actually going to argue this and present you with a set of, you know, options from bad to less bad, often, sometimes even good. But then having, you know, the openness and the willingness to choose the best one there after you've kind of teed up a real debate. And I feel like part of what has been so frustrating about Biden, as I said, he came in with these very long-standing, solidly formed views of not even the post-Cold War, but the Cold War.
Yeah.
You know, that is what has really kind of guided, and you can see it reflected all over the place. And
yeah. We want to go to best take, worst take.
Sure. So this is relevant to our news conversation.
It's all relevant.
Yeah, it's all interconnected, one might say. So the International Crisis Group just published a report titled "Bending the Guardrails: U.S. War Powers After October 7th." And they argue that the Biden administration's approach to Israel's military campaign in Gaza has effectively expanded presidential war powers. And I think it's particularly well timed. They published it the same day that Biden delivered his Oval Office address, when he explained why he's dropping out of the presidential race, but also where he very proudly stated that he's the first president this century to report that the United States is not at war anywhere in the world.
It's amazing. It's an amazing statement.
Incredibly bold.
I mean, and it's not the first time that he said that. I mean, I think he said that at one of the States of the Union.
Yeah.
It
got less play then for some reason.
Like, after the Afghanistan withdrawal, I stand before you with America no longer at war, and it's like, well,
that's some pernicious.
except for those couple dozen places where our troops are literally at war.
Yep. Yeah, Brown Cost of War Institute has tracked this for many years now. I think we conducted counterterrorism operations in almost 80 countries between like 2020 and 2022. It was higher in like the previous 3 years, if I remember correctly.
I was
so
off by a few dozen. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I said a couple dozen. Yeah, so no. I said a couple dozen, but yeah, it's 80. Yeah,
it's a lot.
We've bombed 3 countries this year.
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
like,
just this year, right? Right.
Yeah. So this was an incredibly bold statement. But like the International Crisis Group obviously points all of this out. Like obviously Congress has the sole authority to declare war, to authorize limited uses of military force, like the laws that enabled the Afghanistan and Iraq wars. But very clearly, successive presidents have stretched presidential war powers to justify all sorts of actions, including this administration. And so the International Crisis Group really clearly states that, you know, this is a continuation of a broader trend of the abdication of Congress's constitutional war powers, to legally justify military activities in, as mentioned, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, as well as the Biden administration's efforts to aid Israel's air defense against attacks from Iran, and to construct the failed Gaza pier. We dispatched, I think, 1,000 troops ish to do that. It was up for what, 20 days, and it cost like tens of millions of dollars and didn't really deliver much food. So
it managed to get in like 1 day's worth of overland food.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So it's a well-written report. It gets into all the legalese of war powers issues, but I think really argues that, you know, this is an issue that the next administration, whoever is elected, is really going to have to grapple with, because it sets a pretty dangerous precedent that any future president can exploit for, you know, their own purposes and for even more military actions not authorized by Congress.
Yeah. Good take. I mean, reigning in the imperial presidency is, like, in my mind, it has been since the Trump years, because of the Trump years, the foremost national security priority. The idea that, like, you're going to have the president be able, like a MAGA president, a fascist, be able to just drop bombs on whoever, assassinate whoever, launch nukes at any time. That's not acceptable. That's the death drive for the planet. I mean, like, that has to be a priority. And it shocks me that, like, even progressives don't have a consensus that that should be a priority. And it couldn't be more obvious to me.
I think there is a bit of a consensus, because there was, you know, we worked with, you know, when I was with Bernie, we worked with Murphy and Lee and Rand Paul and a few others on the National Security Reform Act, which was a huge. I mean, it repealed the AUMF. It basically rewrote the War Powers Resolution. It redefined emergency powers in terms of sanctions. I mean, this was a fairly comprehensive, you know, and Biden came in having supported the Yemen War Powers Resolution, and there was at least a kind of nominal commitment to address some of these things. And we're all like, okay, we'll see. Well, we saw, as you know, unfortunately, as it always turns out, where you stand is where you sit, and once you're sitting in the Oval Office, you're like, yeah, maybe I can like.
Once you have the ring, it's suddenly
once you have the once you have the ring, you're like, well, I'll use it for good. But I'll say, I hope and I expect that we will revive this. I mean, because even if you don't pass this whole kind of, you know, kind of omnibus national security reform bill, there's pieces in there that you can strip out and pass on their own. But I think part of what has kind of slowed it down is because it became very clear that we did not have a president who was at all interested in kind of like changing these powers by statute. He was willing to kind of do certain things just by his own personal decision, like diminishing drone strikes, which I think is a huge deal.
Right. And Congress hasn't dealt with it since the 70s, since the Vietnam War was expanded into Southeast Asia. So it's long overdue. I worked on the National Security Reform and Powers Act, the bicameral versions of that bill a few years ago. And it is definitely a whopper. But yeah, I mean, there is a growing cohort of members that are pushing it piecemeal, and hope to see that continue in the next administration. So fingers crossed. But yeah, as you know, like Biden's handling of Gaza has really long-term implications in terms of our ability to, trigger war.
Yeah. I mean, can I make one additional point here? I mean, going back to what Biden said in that Oval Office address,
the one we made,
he said,
peace, or we're not at war.
Well, I mean, he said we're not at war, but then at the end, he ended with the usual, and God bless our troops.
Right.
Which was very much a post 9/11 global war on terror thing that presidents just have said since then.
Yeah. And it also doesn't translate to pulling our troops out. Like there have been upwards of 170 attacks against troops in Iraq and Syria. I think since October 7th. So the statement that we're not at war doesn't translate to taking our troops out of harm's way. Just God bless them. God bless them. Good luck, guys.
Right.
We're narrating out of our national story the harm that we're directing at our own soldiers, and like as if it's not happening, like
I think that's totally right.
That's bad. And like it's a longer story. I've been doing some like research stuff lately about the things that we're starting to spend money on in the Pentagon I mean, we've always done this, but at the unit level, like in the Marines and shit, trying to equip soldiers with the best kinds of like technology and gear and countermeasures for drone warfare and all this stuff. We're spending tons of money to try and protect soldiers at a tactical level, at the level of operations, You actually can't. There is no like sufficient countermeasure that you can provide to a squad of Marines against, aerial bombardment or whatever, like the imbalance is always there. And that means they're always exposed to violence. If you put them in harm's way, you can't technologize your way out of the violence once you commit to an operation. And so we're spending all these monies as in terms of like damage limitation, but it's our choices upstream. It's the actual foreign policy itself that is directing the violence at our own fucking people, And so like, we got to fit. Technology ain't going to save this. We've got to have better judgment. We've got to have a better foreign policy that doesn't generate so much violence and direct it at our own fucking people.
Yeah. I remember something that really struck me about the Tower 22 attack a few months ago. And I think Ken Klippenstein wrote about this, but the fact that base is a drone base and that part of the reason an enemy drone was able to infiltrate the area is because an American drone was scheduled to return to Tower 22 around the same time. And they thought it was an American drone, which I think is really emblematic of what you're talking about, Van.
Yeah. Fucked up. Matt, do you want to talk to us about Netanyahu's fucking...
Yeah. I mean, that was going to be my worst take, but it's almost too easy. So yeah, that speech. I mean, what is there to say? I mean, it was the usual Netanyahu, kind of gaslighting, only more so. It's just, where do I even start? I mean, you had the denial of the famine, the denial that Israel is restricting humanitarian aid, which is just, I mean, the United States government has even said that, right? Privately and publicly, literally every humanitarian aid and NGO has said this. It is a matter of fact, and it's not just, and they'll often turn to, as Netanyahu did, to say, well, we are sending this amount of trucks inside, but it's not just getting trucks over the fence line, Israel into Gaza. There's no way to get aid to people or people to get to aid within Gaza. So that was kind of disgusting. But I mean, it almost, go ahead.
No, it's like the whole "give us the tools, we'll finish the job" shit. Like that's his mantra at this point.
Right, it's his mantra and he knows they won't. And the Israeli military knows they won't, as everyone who kind of understands these issues and like knows Hamas, everyone seems to acknowledge now that Hamas will remain. What role they will continue to play is an open question, but I think everyone understands they will at the very least retain a veto over whoever else comes in or tries to rule Gaza. So they have to be taken into account. So again, this is all just kind of a formula for Netanyahu to just prolong the war as long as possible, because as everyone seems to understand, including the president, he is doing this to preserve his own political career. He understands. So yeah, Netanyahu, bad takes. He has them all the time. But like the worst take in my view, was from basically Washington, not just the people who stood there and clapped like trained seals, but the pundits and the think tank analysts who were like, well, this was a kind of bipartisan speech. He didn't criticize President Biden too much. And it's just like, are you?
And he appealed to Trump too.
Kidding me? I mean, this guy is a corrupt, racist, authoritarian war criminal in the midst of a mass atrocity that has been credibly alleged to be genocide.
Ongoing too. It's not like
ongoing,
this is 20 years ago.
Ongoing, and you're going to rate this like a theater critic. Washington think tanks. I mean, I could name names, but just I'm gonna cast a wide net. Just the general inability to kind of see this for what it is and see Netanyahu for what it is. Just a complete embarrassment and humiliation for everyone.
Yeah. I don't know if you agree with this, but Waleed Shahid had some interesting commentary about this. One of the brains behind the Justice Democrats, and he was basically like,
Waleed,
yeah, he's fucking amazing. He was like, the Democratic Party has basically changed, but the problem is that because like the example being in the speech, a large chunk of Democratic electeds didn't attend the speech.
And almost half of the whole Democratic caucus, which is a huge deal.
Yeah, that's a signal, right? And then on top of that, like only 2 Democrats stayed afterward for the like handshaky shit, right? And if you had done this 15 years ago, of course, it would have been totally like it would have been everybody there, So like there's something in that where like the Democratic Party has changed, and it's the voting power constituency of the Democratic Party is on a different wavelength now than the electeds and the DNC leadership. And the difficulty is like the electeds and the DNC leadership are going to be the last to kind of come around and change, because they're funded by people who aren't the voting bloc of the Democratic Party.
That's right. I mean, I referenced 2011 when Netanyahu spoke in 2011. Tom Friedman wrote a column where he basically said, I hope Netanyahu understands that all that applause was bought and paid for by the Israel lobby. Now, is that an overstatement? Sure. But there's also a lot to that.
Wait, Tom Friedman said that?
Tom Friedman wrote that. Yeah, back in 2011. Wow. 2011.
He's not truth to power, generally speaking.
He has his moments. Sometimes, like actual journalist Tom Friedman, like fights his way out of corporate motivational speaker Tom Friedman's like, I'm still here. That was one of those moments. But I made the comment yesterday. It's like, AIPAC has been spending a lot more now. They've been plowing tens of millions of dollars into Democratic primaries to crush progressives, and they're getting a lot less for it. If you look at the fact that half of the Democratic caucus did not go.
Yeah. So I don't know, I don't know if you want to put a silver lining on the Netanyahu speech, but there was something there that was like, yeah, maybe the Democratic Party really is changing. I guess related to this, I have a best take. It was a letter sent to the president from 7 major unions: the Association of Flight Attendants, American Postal Workers Union, International Union of Painters, the NEA, the National Education Association, SEIU, the Service Employees International Union, the mighty UAW, and the United Electrical Workers. And they represent collectively something like 6 million American workers, which is half of all organized labor in the country.
Yeah.
And they sent a joint letter. Actually, you linked to this in your Kamala Harris piece, but I just want to read like a couple portions of the letter that they sent Biden, not the whole thing. President Biden, we write to publicly call upon your administration to immediately halt all military aid to Israel as part of the work to secure an immediate and permanent ceasefire in the war in Gaza. We believe that immediately cutting U.S. military aid to the Israeli government is necessary to bring about a peaceful resolution to this conflict. We have spoken directly to leaders of Palestinian trade unions who told us heart-wrenching stories of the conditions faced by working people in Gaza. Furthermore, Israel's refusal to minimize civilian harm and its demonstrated restriction of U.S. humanitarian aid call for a halt to U.S. military aid under the Foreign Assistance Act and the Arms Control Export Act. Mr. President, the time to act decisively to end this war is now. Stopping U.S. military aid to Israel is the quickest and most sure way to do so. It is what U.S. law demands, and it will show your commitment to securing a lasting peace in the region. Don't be a fuckface. Do the right thing. I added that last part.
This is where we need an air horn function on our, that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah. I mean, so like, this is the perfect alignment between working class power and peace. Peace is always in the interest of the working classes. And the thing that jumped out was like these unions' direct connections to the Palestinian trade unions was part of what led to this demand.
Yeah, and ideally they would have some conversation ongoing, as they do with the Israeli Labor Party, but unfortunately that party is completely diminished and barely existent and barely represents the workers anymore. But yeah, no, I thought that letter. I mean, that's how we do it, man.
Yeah, true show of international solidarity.
Yep.
That's right. I mean, like the only way to protect workers in a world of like capital mobility is if you have a global working class identity or like a global labor movement, and you start to do that with like national labor movements having solidarity, So.
No, and it's a great example. And I think I'll just refer quickly back to my piece in Foreign Policy on Harris. It goes like, if you're trying to build, and this is where I'll bring in the Vance speech too, because I think my take away from that, and I wrote this elsewhere, was, Vance's speech was making clear, like, this is where the battle for democracy is going to happen, in the appeal to the working class.
Yeah. And that's something that's different from democratic politics 20 years ago, and even from like 2019. Like, labor was a taken for granted constituency in the Democratic Party, and it cannot be anymore. It's making its voice heard. It's growing, and now Republicans are starting to kind of symbolically court them, if not actually do anything for them. So like, on notice. All right. So our final segment each week is called By the Numbers. One of us is going to bring a number, and that number is going to be the starting point for a story. It's going to shed light on a problem or a solution. It's going to be edifying, and it's going to be a number. So my number this week is two numbers, 98 and 3,500. Steven Semler is this amazing data whiz guy, and he wrote a guest post for Spencer Ackerman's newsletter, The Forever Wars, and the post brings the receipts, as he always does, to show that 98% of the pro-Palestinian peace protests since October 7th have been peaceful peace protests.
Yeah.
And, I've been in a couple of these. I've seen physically a bunch of them in 3 countries. They've always been peaceful. And that makes a certain kind of sense, since what they're agitating for is peace, And despite that, police have arrested 3,500 students in these protests. The precise number is like 3,552 students across 81 campuses, right? And it's not because people are getting assaulted. It's not because crimes are being committed, right? It's because what Macklemore said, the problem isn't the protests, it's what they're protesting. So, it goes against what our country is funding. So I'll put a link to the post in the show notes, but 98% peaceful, 3,500 arrests. Something's fucked up in Denmark, No,
it is. I appreciate, and Semler's great. Obviously, as is Ackerman's Forever Wars. But no, Steven Semler is a great writer and analyst. People should definitely check out. But yeah, I mean, I appreciated seeing those hard numbers,
and it does reflect just incredible commitment to principle, training, like community power. The fact that students have over the course of these student protests been able to stay so true to the purpose of the protest and not get emotional or incited by folks that are intentionally provoking them. Honestly, in my personal experience as well at going to some of these demonstrations is, being kind of yelled at by someone on the street like that, I haven't experienced anything like it. Except for going to Planned Parenthood in DC. Every Planned Parenthood I've ever gone to, I've never experienced that kind of, aggression from someone, from a stranger in a public setting outside of accessing reproductive care. So I think that there's also an intersection there to think about, and just like the things that people go through and how like committed they remain to maintaining access to, protest, to healthcare. It's really inspiring. And these are people that, experience that kind of aggression as teenagers or earlier. And so to be the adult in that situation is a big deal.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, and just looking at some of the protests yesterday, I mean, we did an event on the Hill with a number of other groups, brought in an Israeli and a Palestinian peace activist to speak. Really powerful. It was also a place for members of Congress who didn't want to go to the speech just to come and be part of the community. It was a great success. It was really moving. But of course, I saw, a lot of people kind of wandering around the Capitol, overwhelmed. I mean, just completely, exclusively peaceful. But of course, later on, you see some of these pictures. Oh, look at these people over at Union Station. They're spray painting Hamas slogans. Here's a guy with a Hamas flag. And it's like, okay, that's stupid. But does
you look for the outliers, and then you
exactly. And so you have all these, people are now they're not required. They feel required, or they feel pressured to kind of make statements about these idiots with Hamas flags. And I'm like, do you have a fraction of that outrage for what we just heard in Congress yesterday? And it's, a constant, it's not new. It goes back to the history of protest. I mean, I remember, myself being involved in the kind of alter globalization protest at the end of the 90s and early 2000s, where these were huge protests. I mean, basically, if you look at Biden's economic policy, he's admitting we were all right. But of course, you had at that time, you had these, black bloc anarchists who would show up having seen Fight Club too many times. They think they're Tyler Durden and they're going to smash a window. And that's what gets coverage. And everyone is pressured into condemning that to distract from the actual point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what happens when you pay attention only to what you physically encounter in your daily life in the imperial city of Washington, D.C. I'm sorry, but it is unreal seeing these takes on Twitter of how dare you tag, a fake Liberty Bell. Sorry. I know that it matters, but
I'm not in favor of that stuff. I think it's dumb. It's just this dumb radical cosplay. But it's also, let's understand. Okay, we've got a guy here's literally carrying out a mass atrocity at this moment.
Save your ire for the.
If you've not checked that box yet, then consider sitting the fuck down.
Yeah, I saw someone call the area around Union Station, oh my gosh, this looks like a war zone. It's like, have you seen Gaza?
You know what the fuck? Yeah.
What are you talking about?
That's nutty. Yeah. There's more to be said about this, but there's also this through line of violence that we see emerge as a little glimmer. The idea that we're going to use police kind of at scale to crack down on people agitating for peace who are nonviolent, that's the same force of violence that's going to be directed at homeless encampments. Gavin Newsom just made this announcement right now as we're recording this, and growing numbers of people are going to become homeless in a world of economic nationalism, sorry to say, right? So more of us, the people who the majority of the population is economically precarious, to be precarious by definition is you're one medical accident or bad business choice away from becoming a homeless person, and the idea that we're going to use the state to fucking expunge that, police that, exploit that uncompensated labor, the same way that in the MAGA vision, part of this whole women need to go back home and the patriarchy structure is creating a political economy that extracts women's labor uncompensated, domestic labor, right? It's in a world of declining growth, the state tries to find other sources of exploitation, you know, for capital. And that's kind of the world that's starting to emerge. So like, this is inchoate in my mind. I could probably express it better, but there's this very fucking dark through line that we see from patriarchy, all this Handmaid's Tale fucking dystopia shit.
Trad wife resurgence.
Yep. The targeting people who are weak, targeting people who are marginalized, and exploiting it for your own political power, exploiting it for your own security, exploiting it for profit. And it's freaking me the fuck out. I need to take a Xanax or something.
Yeah, it's freaking me out too. This is like such a big conversation that could very easily wormhole. But the one thing I want to say, I think kind of ties back to what we were talking about earlier in regard to JD Vance, which is that the scariest part when we see kind of cultural, not backlash, but like kind of returning to old cultural tropes, is that there is like a kernel of truth in kind of the assertions that group makes. Like, so for example, you know, on the one hand, trad wives do get at something when they say, well, now women have to, or women are expected to not only give birth and heal and raise children, but also bring in half the income and do probably most of the domestic labor, if you know.
Yeah, and that's been an unsustainable kind of situation.
Yeah, and trad wives are like, well, I don't want to work, and let me just do the domestic labor. It's like, well, yeah, working and doing all the domestic labor sucks. Like, in theory, you want you know, an equal partner, but statistically, it's not very likely. So it's like, damn, those women do they are getting at something that everyone is struggling with, I think. And I don't think that like what they're doing is good for women or like good for people or society, but that's what makes it so appealing, is like they're right. Like they're right to a certain extent.
Right. And you know, whereas I think our idea is like, what if we had a social safety net where imagine that both of you
right?
had to work less.
Yeah. No, I mean, there's solutions to this stuff. It's the same with like the right-wing reaction to climate change stuff, or like, you know, it's just that they acknowledge now that, oh, climate change is a thing, but their solution is to pivot that instead of like actually lowering emissions or a just green transition or helping, you know, poorer countries adapt. It's like, well, let's build up a fucking fortress and then close off the brown people coming into our country. You know, like they pivot it to this dark kind of solutionism. And like, but there's always this, like, the thing that they can exploit is a real existing problem that basically left policies are not actually adequately addressing, or like in the US, democratic policies are not actually addressing, you know. It's the failure to have an alternative to the right that gives the right an opportunity, you know.
Right. Because I do think part of what the left has failed to offer is that kind of identity. And I'm not using identity politics in a pejorative way, but like a community is what I guess I'm getting at. It's not just, and I think I was hearing this data the other day, someone was talking about, you know, what brings people into some of these radical groups is not that they believe these things. It's that like they join a group and this becomes their friend group. And they're like, okay, these people believe this. I guess I believe this too. I mean, a lot of this really does come back to the lack of community and the lack of institutions that we have and the various options for community that we have now.
Yeah, and like this has been a point of conversation for so long. Like Robert Putnam's whole career has been has been about building community, about third spaces. There's actually like one reason why I don't know, I think like a lot of people on the left are very critical of, for good reason, religion. I'm not. Like, I grew up in the church. I know you did, Matt. We had very different experiences in that regard, but like I don't write off religion on the whole, because I do see it as one of the only forums through which Americans can like for free hang out with one another. Like I went to youth group 3 days a week for like a bunch of my childhood. I didn't love that.
3 days.
But
wow.
Yeah.
It was like Sunday night and Wednesday night for me. But 3.
Well,
what was the third night?
Well, church basketball was also a big part of that. Big in North Carolina, as you can imagine. It's like, it's not what school do you go to, but what church basketball team do you play for? But where was I going with this? Yeah, community building is important. And like, while the prospect of going off the grid and starting a farm, like, sounds romantic, and maybe it is in some cases, like, that is not viable or good for everyone to pursue. Like, we can work on solidarity with one another, supporting one another, and I think we can all do that. It starts on a personal level.
Yeah, I will add the analysis that alienation was part of the process of neoliberal economics, right? The idea
atomization,
yes, there is no society. That was the whole point. You know, it's to destroy the idea that there are these associations that give us something, you know, because the associations are ways that we can create a bulwark against power, whether it's
because we might start talking to each other and realize we're all getting screwed. And
yes,
that's very dangerous.
You don't want that.
Imagine talking to other people. Imagine caring about other people. That's what's so wild about Vance's whole, like, you shouldn't get to invest in the future if you don't literally procreate. Like, what are you talking about? Oh my God. It's just, it reflects a total disregard for anyone that isn't your flesh and blood. Oh God.
Or one of your major funders.
Right. Those two. Important asterisk.
Yeah, I don't know if Vance is actually gonna. I've heard Trump has had like buyer's remorse with Vance already, which is like a pretty short shelf life.
It's so funny. I had such a giggle when I saw the first headline about that. Like, what an astronomic like rise and fall if that happens.
Record,
record. You know, I'm here for it.
Yeah, that was what I thought too. All right. Any saved rounds? Anything we want to hit before we sign off here?
I don't think so. I think that does it.
I think this is a good one. Feeling good about this one.
Yeah. Well, this was fun, cathartic at least. All right, gang, that's gonna do it. I forgot what the sign off shit is, but catch you next time.
Long and prosper.
All right, yeah.
See y'all.
Peace. All right.